Hi, my name's Ed Durbin, and what I want to talk today about is growth. Growth, growth, growth. This is a question I ask my students in pretty much every class that I teach economics. And I ask them, why is growth so important? And so when we talk about economic growth, what we're really referring to, or typically what we would be referring to, is GDP, or gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is a measure of all goods and services that are sold in an economy for a given period of time, for example, for a quarter, or 3 months, or for a year, et cetera. Typically, we look at it as a year. So what I try to do is I try to draw to draw a connection, if you will, between GDP and income, how it relates to our income. So again, when we're the kind of the overview of this little presentation is that how do we go about growing our economy? How do we go about growing that GDP, that gross domestic product, in a reasonable, rational manner, right? So backing up, as all economists tend to do, that's never anything, is never a straight line, if you will, but we'll make it as simple as we can get it. How about that? But anyhow, at any rate, so when we talk about income, all of us can relate to our income, right? So our income, when it comes down to it, and again, keeping it very simple, is that it ends up in three categories. First goes to taxes. You have to pay taxes first, right? Payroll taxes, withholding taxes, etc. We get to see this in our paychecks, or maybe we don't, I guess. The second piece of that, of course, goes to our consumption, what we go out there and buy, what we spend our income on, and whatever's left over, that residual is saving. And notice there's no S on the end of savings. It's saving in economics for whatever reason. At any rate, that's, kind of laying the ground rules. We're talking about that income, okay? Okay, so now I just want to quickly walk through GDP, or gross domestic product. And again, gross domestic product is the total market value of all goods and final goods and services produced within an economy. So in this case, domestically within the U.S. And we typically look at GDP, or gross domestic product, in terms of real GDP or nominal GDP. And the real GDP is what we're doing is we're adjusting our current dollars, if you will, for inflation. So if it's an example, we have 10% inflation, you have a dollar bill in front of you today, and you take the dollar bill out in 1 year's time, and it still says $1. But with 10% inflation involved, they would reduce the value of that dollar to 90 cents, reduces the purchasing power. That's, again, when we talk about GDP on a personal note, we want to look at it in terms of real GDP. Nominal GDP is where we operate for tax purposes and so on and so forth in the economy. But when it comes right down to it, all of us are much more interested in that real GDP, okay, that real gross domestic product. So again, when we talk about GDP and we talk about trillions of dollars, I think the 2023, we're going to be talking about that in a moment. I think it was about $27 trillion, and it's very difficult to kind of get your head wrapped around that. But the idea is that the linkage between that economic growth, that GDP, that gross domestic product, and income is actually a subset of that economic growth. So whatever you're producing, of course, think about it in terms of you're producing something at a firm, and of course, what does a firm do? What does that enterprise do? They pay you wages, and that would be that income piece that would be going back to you for that. At any rate, so when we talk about, again, about the real versus nominal, and when we talk about income in particular, we're more concerned about not how much money that we're earning, but how much that money will actually pay for, or the purchasing power of that of the dollars that we have in our pocket, our billfold, our purses, etc. So this is drilling down to where that economic growth, trying to making that connection. Economic growth benefits individuals because, again, that connection between economic growth and what your income, your personal income, more to the point. Okay, so speaking of GDP and national income, this is something through what's called the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the Department of Commerce, and they run these statistics all the time, and they update them on a quarterly basis. And so typically we can look at things, and again, on a quarterly basis for economic growth, et cetera, or easier to just look at it in the annual terms. So in this case, we're looking at it, the most recent data that I could put together, and that was, again, the GDP, or that gross domestic product in the U.S. So these are nominal dollars, okay? They're not real dollars in terms of adjusting for inflation. So these are the inflated dollars that are out there. Nonetheless, $27.7 trillion, lots out there. So that's the GDP. And then we work our way down. Remember, we're trying to get down to that national income. So the next step down is GNP, or the gross national product. The difference between the two is that with GDP is all production within the U.S. economy. So whether we're talking about Ford Motor Company in the U.S. or Toyota Motor Company in the U.S., it's all counts toward the GDP. The GNP, what happens is the expression is that we repatriate those earnings, those receipts, if you will. So for example, moving from GDP to GNP, for GNP, it would be Ford Motor Company domestic, and also repatriating, bringing those dollars back in from Ford Motor Company of Europe, et cetera. And likewise, the Toyota production in the U.S. counts toward our GDP, but it counts toward what? Japan's GNP. So those dollars leave the country, the earnings leave the country, going back to the home country. In this case, we're talking about Japan. And then we move on to net national product. And the difference between GNP and net national product is depreciation. And I won't go into much detail on that, but this is an accounting artifice, if you will, an accounting part. And so we're reducing it by again, this is over $4 trillion down to net national product. And that gets us basically to that national income, which is, again, what we're trying to drive at. This is what we're all interested in, what national income. So this is where I get my students' attention, showing this connection, if you will, between that economic growth, that production that's out there, all those goods and services that are sold in the economy, and the direct, actually very, very close connection with that national income, okay? And of that national income, again, in this case, about 61% of that income, of the personal income, actually, which is very close to national income, accounts that goes toward compensation of employees in terms of wages and salary. So that's the direct connection, if you will, walking it down from GDP to national income. So speaking of income, and this is again something all of us we're very much interested in, and we're most interested in, of course, in the real income, that adjusting for the inflation, stripping away the inflation to see how far your money will actually go. And so what's interesting is that this doesn't go back, well, we go back to the year 2000. And what's interesting is that if you go for the year 2007 through 2016, we had a dip in real median income. So that was the result of going through the financial collapse and pretty dreary circumstances. And it took us all the way, again, 11 years from 9 years rather, 2007 through 2016 to get back to that previous level. Since that time, we continued to drive upward, and then in 2019, we hit our high water mark, at least to this point, of $81,210 per household. And remember, when we talk about household, that is not per person, it's per household. So we have 335 million population, and we have 128 million households within that. So that would be people living within that household, 1, 2, 3 people that would be living within that household. That's the combined incomes. So oftentimes you're talking about 2 people working. At any rate, the good news is that we're getting back to the previous level, the previous high of 2019. But there was a dip again associated with COVID, and we still have a ways to go to kind of continue to climb out of that, to get us past that $81,000 per household, right? So again, we're back to that linkage, in terms of how do we grow this economy? How do we get those incomes back up, the real incomes back high to higher levels, right? To $81,000 and beyond per household. So looking at it in terms of our historic like GDP growth rates. So you're going to see this on the next graph, but we had um, we had a period of time where we were growing at about a three plus% rate going back into the 80s and going up to around the year 2000. So a 20 year period roughly. We had in excess of 3%. 3% is a good solid growth rate. Like to grow more, but we certainly would not like to grow less. And this is the problem that we've experienced, again, kind of going forward from about 2000 through present. So the following 20 years or so, the average growth rate had been about 2.1%. So again, this is something that's a bit of it's more than a bit of concern because again, that economic growth is something that all of us but at this point, all of us should understand that this is a direct relation to what? To our income. So the faster the economy grows, the faster our income grows. And again, we're talking about the real growth here that we're referring to when we're looking at these GDP growths. So we need that to sustain that 3% growth rate or exceed that going forward. If it would even be better, right? So here's the graph that I was referring to, and basically we're saying that from 1980 through 2000-ish, we had about a 3% or 3.2% growth rate, and subsequent to that time, we've had a kind of an anemic growth rate of 2.1%. Again, we've had a lot of problems in this time, but it's been kind of flat. We have not kind of picked up that 3%. And that's kind of the objective, is to get us, how do we get back to that 3%? So kind of keep that in mind. So one of the challenges that we often hear, like from economists and whatnot, is that, yes, it would be great to have, a more rapid economic growth, 5, 6, 7%. But there's always a concern that inflation might creep in. And so when we're talking about inflation, of course, means the price level changes, price levels going up over a period of time, which we've all experienced. So there are two basic types of inflation. One is demand pull inflation, where the consumers are paying higher prices for whatever the goods and services that they're purchasing. And that can be driven by a lot of things, but just a shortcut on this is that they're just definition-wise, too many dollars chasing too few goods. Part of that could be prompted by when we had like stimulus checks and so on and so forth during COVID. We had more money in our pocket to spend, but the problem was, of course, that we did not have access to, all you had to do was drive past a car dealership during that time frame, and there were no cars on the lot. Anyhow, this is something very recent memory for all of us, unfortunately. But again, the point is this is what we call demand pull inflation. So at its root, when we talk about inflation, inflation really is, again, prices are increasing. And in the simplest terms, it means that when we say who drives up prices, it would be at the firm, where the firm raises prices, which gets us back to this cost push inflation idea, keeping that in mind what I just said about firms raising prices. So higher production costs this is that cost push inflation coming from the household going to the firm, meaning, where the firm is paying more for labor, raw materials, all the production costs are driven up, et cetera. And so in likewise, what happens is, of course, is that the firm has to do something with those costs. And ideally, what they would like to do is pass them on directly to the consumer. But this is where this competition part comes into play. And if the more competitive are the markets, the more difficult it is for that firm to pass those costs on. So again, kind of keep this in mind. So the idea is that how do we go about balancing this growth without causing inflation? And the reason that's an issue, if you will, again, is because of the, economic growth does not, it kind of comes in fits and starts on if you will, in terms of, we have a term in economics where we say that production is lumpy, meaning that things don't always go according to plan. You want to increase production, but there are hiccups, problems with the system. And when there's a shortage of something, supplies, supply chains, right, that we already talked about, again, speaking to that cost push inflation, where we had supply chain issues, that's going to certainly drive up the cost of those goods and services going forth to the consumer. So again, it's managing this economy without causing significant inflation. And much of that is really, it comes down to how competitive markets truly are. So again, without going into too much detail, looking at the graphic here, this is something that's called the personal consumption expenditures. This is coming from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and I'll be showing you another one coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, showing this as well. And this is that the consumers paying higher prices for whatever those goods and services are. And of course, we saw this huge spike going back to 2022, and it's come down significantly to 2.7. And the latest one I had here was from 2000. I should have had a more recent number, but at any rate, it's come down, but it's actually gone back up a bit as well. It's one of these things where when we look at these prices coming down, it takes a while for this to kind of course through the economy to make its way through. So again, this is a personal consumption expenditure representation of that. So this is the next one from the from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a little better presentation here in terms of the more recent data, if you will. And yes, it's gone down significantly. But remember, now keep in mind that we really hadn't seen the level of inflation that we saw in 2022 in how long? 40 years, basically, right? Going back to 1981. It's remarkable that that it spiked so high, and it caused great problems with the economy when we had issues again when we're talking about helicoptered funds that were coming in, through government in terms of the stimulus checks and so on and so forth, and all the other issues that kind of emanated from the supply side, frankly, in terms of supply chain issues and higher cost of energy, etc. Anyhow, so speaking of the supply side or the cost push inflation side, we also saw, of course, this price spikes on that side, going through to the firm paying higher prices for, again, fuel cost, all those supply chain issues that we all saw firsthand, if you will. We experienced these things. And yes, it had come back down, but you'll notice that it's creeping back up again. And the problem with this is beyond, beyond the obvious, inflation is inflation. But when you have inflation on the rise on the cost push side or on the supply side, if you will, the costs have to go somewhere. It goes to the firm, and the firm does what? Passes those higher prices, if you will, onto the consumer. So it bleeds through onto the consumer side rather quickly, or more quickly, or more quickly than we'd like, at the very least. At any rate, this is just kind of to give you an illustration, a picture of that. So how do we control that bugaboo, that bugaboo of inflation that prevents us, or oftentimes causes disruptions when we talk about economic growth? So the first part we could look at is in terms of the cost push inflation by reducing energy costs going in, increasing supply of energy, increasing the supply of fossil fuels and all fuels, if you will, whether we're talking about fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, nukes, more green energy, et cetera, coming from solar power, wind power, any other number, the whole shebang that would do wonders in terms of keeping prices down, keeping energy costs down for the producer, and ultimately for the for the consumer. And this is where we talk about when competition comes through. So for example, so if you've got a competitive market and you're producing something and your energy costs go down by 20, fuel costs go down by 25%. Initially, what you'd like to do is hang on to that savings on your own in terms of higher profits. But if there's sufficient competition, it gets passed through very quickly to whom? To the consumer, lower prices, because otherwise, if you keep your prices high, your competitor is going to reduce theirs and it's going to take your market share. Anyway, that's kind of the idea of, so long as there's competition, it tends to tamp down inflation, at least on the cost push side, on the supply side. And that goes that goes a long way in ensuring a stable economy and also economic growth. Okay, so jumping next into the government portion of it, we've been talking about the markets between the household and the firm, but just to interject a bit with government coming in, basically there are two types of government policies. One would be fiscal policy, so fiscal, think in tax in terms of taxes and spending, tax and spend. So this is at the federal level, it's Congress, the House and the Senate. And at the state and local level, of course, there are legislatures that would be involved there as well in terms of spending and, taxing and the taxing authority of this, the taxing jurisdiction, et cetera. And so that's on the government side. The other side of that would be monetary policy, which is only at the federal level, which would be through the Federal Reserve System. And more to the point, the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, they're the ones that are responsible for managing those interest rates that are so important for economic growth, because if interest rates are too high, people tend to shy away from borrowing. And when I say people, I mean both businesses and the consumer. So anyway, just to kind of put a label out there for that. So sticking with the government here, when we talk about the impact of our government debt, this is something that's been out in the media quite a bit, and that's been on my radar for a long time, and other economists have been concerned about this again for quite some time. So basically, when we're looking at a $36.2 trillion debt, and with continued deficits, going forward now, we're $2 trillion and likely to hit that number again for this next upcoming fiscal year. And the concern is not just the number, the huge number, 36.2 trillion, and then tack on another 2 trillion next year. It also has much to do with the interest that we're paying on this debt. And that interest is rising for a variety of reasons. One, because we're adding more to the debt. Secondly, because interest rates are rather high. And without getting into much detail, just kind of take that with you. It's a challenge for us. So how do we grow? How can a growing economy kind of help us in terms of these deficits? And we're going to talk about that further here. So again, this is something I talk about in my classes, and there's no secrets with this. It's pretty straightforward, and that is that higher GDP, of course, leads to what? Higher incomes. And higher incomes, more jobs out there as the economy is spurred on. So it's not just the income, it's also the number of jobs, et cetera. And as a result of which we end up with higher tax revenues. Higher tax revenues come in, and what that does is it gets people back to work. It takes people off, welfare rolls. It reduces the number of people that are on Medicaid. And it helps spur the economy on in that way, and it also you end up with collecting more taxes. So those higher taxes are helpful in terms of reducing the debt, the deficit, and maybe eliminating the deficit would be nice, and also having an impact on the debt, reducing its growth at the very least. With those more tax revenues that are flowing in, not higher tax rates, not higher taxes, but more tax revenue flowing in. And also this economic growth that we're talking about, it's not just going to taxes, it's also going to consumption. That more things that people are buying more things, and also you end up with more saving. And savings goes very, very quickly into investment. And that investment also adds more to the economy in terms of like adding technology at firms and so on and so forth. It's, when things are moving in the proper direction, good stuff, right? At any rate, this is the importance of that economic growth. So once again, making this very, very personal for my students, I point to, again, this growing the GDP at a 3% or higher rate. And when I say higher rate, there's no reason why we can't grow at 4%, 5%, make it 6%, so long as we don't experience the inflationary pressures. And so long as we've got competitive markets out there, those inflationary tendencies toward inflation are mitigated, if you will. And anyway, that's for another topic of conversation. Nonetheless, the higher GDP equates with what? Higher wages, more jobs out there for people, and that overall increases national prosperity. Because after all, I'm very much desirous of being able to collect Social Security at some point in time, and as it stands right now, by the year 2033, 2034, Social Security is going to be reduced by 35% if nothing is done. So we'll just say it's something that would be beneficial for the economy in toto, right? Economic growth is really, truly the key. So again, to put a bow on this 5-minute presentation that turned into half an hour. So economic growth it's that higher income leading to better living standards for all of us. Especially when we're talking about real economic growth, real GDP growth, real income growth. Okay, and so long as we've got that inflation under control, and we have coordinated properly with government, meaning that the fiscal authority, the tax and spend, the legislatures are working, toward that. Again, the goal toward growing that economy, toward that sustainable economy, while at the same time monitoring that outstanding debt that's there, not just outstanding in terms of it's just huge, right? Some way of mitigating, at least to start with, reducing deficits, et cetera, and also getting the Fed lined up in a proper manner to better deal with the economy in terms of interest rates. And we're in a tough spot right now, so far as government is concerned, period. But at any rate, it's very important to, understand, what it takes for us to grow this economy. Economic growth, higher incomes are terribly, terribly important. And there are a lot of things, a lot of components that go into this to make this work. And in my view, this is what drives that sustainability going forward. Because, in all honesty, a growing economy, a vibrant growing economy, is something that benefits all people. And you can take it however way you want it, but this is my main thrust in terms of economics, in terms of sustainability. You have to have a growing economy. You have to have a healthy economy along with that higher incomes and everything that goes along with it. Anyway, thank you for listening.